Welcome to the power of our story. We are a place of safety for our protectors to process the journey together with others that get it. Please don't waste your years suffering in silence. You can reach out to us on the power of our story and meet our amazing community that cares about you and understands. Tonight, we welcome someone that I know pretty well. I consider a good friend, Miss Stephanie Kiesow. Stephanie is a former cop, the wife of a cop, and the daughter of two cops. From 2006 through 2022, Stephanie worked for 3 police agencies on the Central Coast of California, the last several years as a sworn police officer. In 2022, Stephanie left her job as a police officer and now focuses her time on researching and mitigating workplace contributing factors to suicide within first responder agencies, as well as increase organizational and occupational wellness through anecdotal and science-backed methods, partially through her Ph.D. program in organizational psychology. In addition to her professional roles with First Responder Wellness, the Counseling Team International, Stephanie teaches for the Peace Officer Standards and Training and Standard and Training for Corrections. Her certified therapy dog is a contributing writer and speaker for several I didn't know your dog was a contributing writer. That's amazing.
I know, that's all right. Gets everybody
and
laughing.
is the published best-selling author of her book titled Workicide. Get it. Stephanie has also been featured on Law Enforcement Today, the Police Tribune, and Blue Lives Matter. When not working, teaching, or writing, Stephanie spends her time with her husband, sons, and her beloved pets. Welcome, my sister.
Thank you. I'm super excited to be here and very appreciative of the invitation. So thank you to you both. I suppose it would be best if I perhaps dove a little bit more into who I am. So like Todd said, I'm Stephanie Kiesow. I'm super excited to be here and really talk about something that I am super passionate about. Although I will sort of give a disclaimer. One, I tend to have a potty mouth, so sorry if that offends anybody. Okay, I figured I was in good company here. I think being the daughter of two cops, I'm predisposed to that. But there are two people here that I am friends with, and I think parts of my story might be a little surprising. And so this is going to be a unique chance for me to just kind of put it all out there. So it'll be a good time. But like Todd said, I'm a former cop, the wife of a cop, and the daughter of two cops. And so altogether, if you count my non-sworn time, I did 16 years in law enforcement, the last several as a sworn cop. I'm here in Santa Barbara County, still here, which is where I was a police officer as well as a dispatcher before I was a cop. But like Todd mentioned, I left my job in 2022, which I'll get a little bit more into exactly why. But what I specifically research and study these days are work-related contributing factors to suicide within first responder industries. And so I specifically look at organizational stressors and traumas, occupational stressors and traumas, and try to reverse engineer how can we in law enforcement, but also individual departments, prevent or at least mitigate these issues going forward. So a lot of suicide prevention work, which I'll expand on a little bit later on. But perhaps a quick run through of my background so you can kind of get a sense of my upbringing, which definitely contributed to my worldview growing up. Both my parents are now retired cops. And, you know, growing up as a cop's kid is a little tough. You're sort of labeled as a social outcast, right? Because nobody wants the cops kid around to squeal about whatever teenage nonsense is happening, right? So wasn't really invited to the parties, to the bonfires. I'm pretty sure I didn't have a dude touch me until I was like 32 because everyone was so scared of my parents. But because of that and my parents, I very much grew up with this kind of indirect identity in law enforcement, although at that time I wasn't. But I identified very much so with those in law enforcement. And one big event for me that really solidified that feeling was when I was in elementary school. This was in the early 90s. So I'm letting you know my age here real quick right off the bat. But my worldview sort of was confirmed for me. And what happened on this fateful day was that my father, who was a police officer at this time, he was a slick sleeve patrolman. He was involved in an OAS, officer involved shooting, and he killed someone. Now, without getting into the specifics, because I don't think it's relevant to this part of the story, but I very much believe, and due to the facts and investigation, a lot of us have speculated that this was a suicide by cop situation, which is ironic to me because I actually teach on this exact subject. I teach suicide by cop in an 8-hour post class to cops, so I find that ironic. But I firmly believe that this person's desired end result was to die at the hands of police, which was the end result. But despite his motivation, after the suspect died, his two brothers, who were documented gang members in Arizona, drove to California to kill the cop who killed their brother, my dad. I remember being taken out of school for a period of time because there were threats against kidnapping, bodily harm, revenge. And I just remember my dad being really different. And easy to say, this event changed my dad, my family, and really just confirmed my worldview that law enforcement was good, everybody else not good. Not necessarily bad, but just not good in the sense of not trustworthy. At least that's how I felt initially. And so processing at a young age that someone potentially wanted to do me harm because of my dad's job really cemented this identity, being in or affiliated with law enforcement. I also remember growing up, I was driving very often with my dad in his old Ford pickup truck. And a few times he'd be like, "Hey, get down on the floorboard. Don't get up until I say so." And I would do it. And I didn't really understand why at the time, because I'm still, very young, elementary school age. And there was also a time in the front yard we were playing catch because I was super into baseball and softball. And in a very stern voice, he told me to go inside and lock the door. And so later on, as I got older, I sort of put the puzzle pieces together and realized that it was due to my dad working narcs. He was an undercover narc for several years, and put some big time players away. That later on I would find out put a green light out on my dad. My dad was number one hit that people were looking at. So again, law enforcement safe, rest of the world super, super scary. Now, despite all of that growing up, I knew I wanted to be somehow involved in law enforcement, but initially had zero desire of becoming a cop. Like zero, like -0, -5, whatever that number is. I had zero desire. I actually thought about going to the fireside. Come to think of it, I made the wrong choice here. But I think it's because I didn't really want to be in the shadow of my parents. And so when I was 18, so this was 2006, I started working for my local police agency as a non-sworn employee. And I did this for 5 years. And so I did parking enforcement. I was a red light investigator. So, after somebody ran a red light in my city and the cameras went off, I would do certain things to confirm, was this the registered owner? Or if not, who was the driver? Because, believe it or not, a lot of times people would want to claim that their car was stolen to get out of an expensive ticket, right? So my job was to be like, actually, this is your wife. Actually, this is your adult son. Actually, one time, actually, I think this might be your mistress. So lots of fun times. But I really loved the agency that I was at. Great leaders, great employees. Everyone was supportive, at least in, professional sense. And I really saw myself there long term. And then 2006 was also when I became friends with a guy named Ricky, who is a very important part of my story. And so Ricky's dad was also a cop, and Ricky was 4 years older than me, but we had very similar upbringings because our fathers worked together at the same agency. So Ricky initially started out working non-sworn, just like I did, and then a few years later became a cop for the same agency. So fast forward 2010, Ricky and I started dating. And eventually I graduate college with my bachelor's in psychology, and bummer for me, the department that we are all at was really good about retaining their employees. And so in the 5 years that I was there were no open full-time spots with benefits, aside from becoming a cop, which at that time I didn't want to do. And so after I graduated and waited for a little bit, nothing was opening up. And so I left. So fast forward 2011, I started working for sort of a neighboring police agency about 30 minutes north as a full-time police and fire dispatcher. So yay to my dispatchers in the group. And man, that place was rough, real rough, completely different from my first department. The supervisors were not leaders, very bad bosses. Everyone hated each other. I was miserable. Everyone around me was miserable. And after about the first 6 months of me starting as a dispatcher in a group of 4, I was the only one left. 2 got fired because they weren't quick enough in the job, and then 1 quit because she was so negatively impacted by the job and the work environment that she went on antidepressants and was about to go through a divorce. So a lot of work impacts for her. And there's, just to give you an idea of how shitty things got. I remember one time I was still on training, answering the 911 line, and I had paused for, maybe 2 or 3 seconds to think of how to articulate a question that I wanted to ask the caller. And apparently I was taking too long. And so my training supervisor literally backhand slapped me because I was taking too long. Like hit on the floor there in dispatch. And I'm like, I'm pretty sure this is illegal, but like I can't say anything, obviously. So just a really bad place to be. And it wasn't just dispatch, it was the whole department that was like that. So sort of long story, somewhat shorter. October 2011, I noticed Ricky was just different. He was a cop. I'm a dispatcher at this time. And he, like many of us in law enforcement, saw and went through and experienced a lot of really shitty things. And he, like many of us in law enforcement, didn't really have the healthy coping skills in place. And so he, like a lot of us, turned to maladaptive ways to cope. So lots of sleeping around, lots of self-medicating with alcohol, bad money moves that were super fun and exciting in the moment. And then he also, like a lot of us, really over-identified with his job. Being a cop was like all he aspired to be. He ate, slept, breathed cop work. So on this particular shift he's working, he worked a graveyard shift, so 6 p.m. to 6 a.m. And he got wind that he was about to be in an IA, internal affairs investigation, which, judging by the group we have here today, I probably don't need to explain what that is and the stressors that brings. But for him, and knowing as much as I knew about him, I think the thought of him possibly losing his identity, or at the very least his reputation, regardless of the outcome, was too much for him. In addition to all of the other things that I've mentioned so far. And so on what I think he thought was his last shift before being placed on admin leave for the IA, he intentionally turned off his MDC, his in-car computer, which therefore turned off his GPS to his location. And he made the very permanent decision that night to die by suicide, just outside of his patrol car with his duty gun. Now, he's working a graveyard shift, and eventually he gets dispatched to a call, and dispatch can't get a hold of him. His colleagues can't get a hold of him on the phone. And so this sort of starts a citywide search, trying to figure out what happened to him. Is he okay? Was he ambushed? Is he hurt? And it took some time, but eventually when he was found, it was very clear that he was already gone. And so I was woken up that morning super early by a mutual friend who wakes me up at my apartment. He tells me what happened. And I was completely shocked. And shocked is like not even the right word. Whatever word conveys shocked times 1,000 is like what I felt. Still to this day, I don't know how to articulate that feeling. But as time went on, and I think a lot of us felt really guilty because there were absolutely red flags that we didn't recognize before his death. Hindsight's always 2020, right? And you don't know what you don't know, which is such a frustrating phrase, but it's so damn true. I didn't know what I didn't know. And so I really felt like I had failed Ricky to a certain extent. And so for me, this really was the single event that really changed my trajectory, at least educationally, because it started this sort of obsessive curiosity for me to study and research and immerse myself in the world of suicide. Why would someone opt for it? What had to be true for someone to get to that point mentally? Because I really was determined to not fail anyone else ever again. And so to give you an idea of how difficult and awful the department that I was at when this all happened was, I couldn't get time off because I was new and I didn't have enough vacation time. And they were like, nope, sorry, you're SOL. So kind of on top of trying to process his death, I actually had to work the shift that night, had to go into work right after this whole ordeal. And on top of all that, fielding gossipy questions from everyone that wants to be in the know. And I'm working with the petty betties and, the morally disabled coworkers that don't give a damn about anybody but themselves, right? So really, really difficult time. But eventually, time passes. I try to move on as best as possible. And so a few years later, I meet a guy at my second department. I'm still there. He's a cop. I'm still a dispatcher. We get married. Fast forward 2016, I'm pregnant with my first son. Now, my cop husband was one of our department's CSI officers, which is a little odd because this department did things a little different in that instead of training every officer to conduct their own CSI, which a lot of departments do, they instead had one designated CSI officer on each squad, and that was the person responsible for doing all the CSI work. So the photos, dusting for fingerprints, booking the bloody clothes, all that. One person, which is kind of shitty because that one person now has to respond to all of the really shitty calls because they're now involved in the CSI of them all. And I didn't see it back then, but his job absolutely affected him. One particular case that was probably the most egregious example of that was that him and his partners went on a check the welfare that the end result was that the wife was murdered by the husband who is still at home. And as they breach in the doorway, her head kind of gets smushed between the door opening. And it very much impacted those that were there. So I knew that he was impacted. I just didn't know to what extent until I was 8 months pregnant. So this is March of 2016, and I'm about as big as a gray whale, or at least I feel like that, right? And I've already put in my paperwork to let my department know that I'm not coming back once my maternity leave runs out. And it was then, 8 months pregnant, that I find out that my husband's having an affair. So sleeping around. Maladaptive coping, very similar with Ricky. And so the stress from all of that really affected me physically. And so I ended up having some pregnancy complications, had a C-section a few weeks early, but my son comes out healthy, thank God. And so I try the stay-at-home mom thing. We go through extensive marriage counseling for about a good year, and we give it a good try. I am proud of us for us trying as hard as we did, but I kind of saw the writing on the wall, and I ended up going to my third department as a part-time dispatcher, and then ended up filing for divorce. And so I'm a newly divorced mom of a 1.5-year-old, and I'm living out of the bedroom of my friend's house, trying to live on a part-time dispatcher salary, which obviously did not last long. And so my next logical step was the police academy. And I sort of made this decision because one, I needed a better way financially to support my son. Two, the agency that I worked for, my third agency, my third and last agency, was great. Amazing, supportive. Everybody was so great. I loved it there. So I figured, if I'm ever going to be a cop, it's going to be now with this agency. And then third reason, law enforcement was all I ever knew. I grew up in law enforcement. I was comfortable around law enforcement. It was already part of my identity. And so it was a sort of a natural leveling up for me. And so when my son was about a year and a half, I went into the police academy, which in and of itself is really rough. I was 30 when I went through the academy. One of the oldest in my group. I was the only parent. So aside from everybody else who was like 22 and a Caucasian male, like nobody knew what my life was, right? And that was really hard because I had to sacrifice basically my relationship with my young son for about 6 months. I only saw him for a few hours on the weekends, and that was my relationship with him. But I told myself that if I could just get through it, everything would be all better. And so I focused on it and I did it. I graduated a little after my son's second birthday, started field training. Now I come back to my department, right? Because when we go into the police academy, we go away for 6 months, come back. And I come back and everything just imploded. The department, 180 degrees different from the department that it was before I left. Like internal issues causing coworkers to civilly sue other coworkers. Cops were suing other cops. Other people were suing their supervisors, which led for a very paranoid and unsupportive work environment, like very similar to the second department, which is a lot of the reason why I left. And I was just like, WTF, like what happened? I was only gone 6 months. So anyways, I keep my head down, stay out of the drama. I breeze through training. I was told by someone that I take to police work like a fish in water. I'm like, okay, great. So I'm rocking it, having fun. I worked in a big college town on weekend nights. So you could probably guess how my shifts went. Lots of alcohol fueled everything, fights, rapes, calls, crimes, everything. But it was really busy. It was fun. I was in foot pursuits, vehicle pursuits, felony stops. I actually helped to stop a car that turned out to be an illegal gun dealer who had over 40 ghost guns in the car that we stopped. So he went away to prison for over a decade, which is like a big deal here in California. But most of that was from proactive work. And so I really enjoyed being proactive, pulling people over, just getting into shit. But then 2020 rolls around, right? George Floyd's death, defund the police movement, COVID. And so my department, who is very much so controlled by a lot of liberal bureaucracies, we're told you guys all are to stand down. You're basically a firefighter. You are forbidden from leaving the station to do anything proactive. So you can leave if you get a call, but that is literally it. And so when we did leave for a call, as I'm sure many here, if you were working, because of the whole defund the police movement, I and my partners, we were hit, kicked, spit on. I was told that I should be raped merely because of the uniform that I wore and what it represented during this social movement. But that was really hard for me because, again, growing up in law enforcement and now becoming a police officer myself, this was like an attack on me. It felt like a very personal attack. And so that sort of changed the trajectory of my mindset a little bit. So fast forward, all the things, lots of moral injuries, lots of difficult shifts, really difficult work environments. May of 2020 was when I hit probably my lowest low, and everything really caught up to me that I've mentioned up to this point. I had done a pretty poor job of processing childhood stuff, Ricky's stuff, toxic workplaces, the affairs, my divorce, the mental exhaustion from trying to help out other coworkers who were struggling. Two of them ultimately died by suicide as well. Lots of moral injuries. You know, I come from the era of my parents where it's like, suck it up, buttercup, figure it out, right? You don't reach out for help. You don't say anything. You just strap up your bootlaces even tighter, and you keep on going. So I felt very isolated. I was very much so desensitized to death and the pain of others, really desensitized to my own psychological pain, and just really felt like a burden to my family because on my off days, all I wanted to do was just be by myself, sleep, veg. That's all I wanted to do. And because of the whole social movement with the defund the police aspect of things, I was really confused about my identity. Instead of being super proud and happy of who I was and what I did, I would lie to people and say that I was a vet. I worked for the county. I was almost embarrassed, which led to kind of this identity crisis a little bit internally. So I began ideating about my own death, suicide. And I didn't necessarily want to die. I just wanted the pain to stop, the psychological pain to stop. And part of my emotions in all of this was the stressors, the traumas sort of accumulating, but feeling alone, right? Like not feeling like I can reach out to anyone. It's a really lonely feeling, which is really odd because so many of us in law enforcement feel this exact same way. But because of stigma, the stigma of mental health support in general, but especially in law enforcement, this shit's real. You know, you're told, I remember day one of the police academy, as well as when I go on FTO, if you ever raise your hand and say, I need help, you're probably going to lose your gun, probably going to lose your badge, your livelihood, basically everything that I'd worked so hard to achieve up to that point. And I sacrificed part of my relationship with my son. So I was damned if I was going to let anybody take that away from me. So I stayed quiet for a while, struggled for a while, ideated a while, and one shift that was pretty bad. That was when it really hit me. That's when things got pretty bad for me on a mental health level. This particular shift involved really, really awful, shitty leaders that would throw us to the social justice wolves any chance they could. It also involved a dead baby that I couldn't save. And it involved the thought process that I finally understood the feelings Ricky must have felt before he did what he did. I got it. I understood it. But before I could really act on any of these really dark thoughts, I kept getting sent to calls because I'm working and I'm like, what the fuck? Like, why is it so busy tonight? And so I remember thinking like, gosh, I don't want to deal with anybody else's problems. Like, I can't even handle my own. I'm just like so done with all this. So after a call, I was talking to my partner, who he and I had gone through the police academy together. We were super tight. I literally would tell him all the time, "You're like the little brother I never wanted." And so he and I were very close. So we have our patrol cars parked side by side. You know, our driver's sides are next to one another. And I just unintentionally lose my shit, like uncontrollably crying, hysterical. I could not stop myself no matter how hard I tried. It just all came out. Um, Now, you know, keep in mind, my partner and I went through the police academy together, like really challenging parts of life. Like I had cracked the underside of my kneecap doing a burpee and I couldn't tell anybody because I didn't want to get flunked out of the academy. And, you know, he had his own struggles. And so like we've gone through some shit, but he had never up to this point seen me even shed a tear. And so now I'm like ugly crying next to him. Like something was clearly wrong, right? And so after a bit, I looked at him, certainly the worst that he had ever seen me. And I told him that I needed to tell him something. But before I did, I needed him to swear that he would never tell a soul. Because again, stigma, scared of losing everything. Um, and so basically, in no uncertain terms, I told my dear friend, this brother, that if he told anyone, he was going to force my hand, which is really, really shitty of me to have said. But he agreed, and I think he knew at this point exactly what I was trying to convey. And I just looked at him and I said, I think I need some help. And then right about that moment, as the universe would have it, we get sent to a call. So I kind of clean myself up as best as I can, go on to deal with somebody else's bullshit. But after we handle the call, I remember feeling a slight relief that I think was attributed to just being able to kind of offload that, tell somebody. So I generally felt a little bit better, a little bit more connected. So we go to a few more calls, and when I wasn't physically in front of him, in front of my partner, he would text or call me like he was like demanding like proof of life. And so he was constantly getting in touch with me that shift and made me promise, he made me promise that I wouldn't do anything stupid during our shift. And I agreed. So toward the end of our shift, he and I met up again, which was usual because we're trying to stay awake. And he shared with me that he and his wife were expecting, which was really great news because they had been trying for a long time to get pregnant. It was still super early. They had not told anyone, not even their families, but he showed me his phone, and on his phone was a little sonogram photo. And in the middle of the sonogram was tiny little P, little tiny little P. And he pointed to the little P and he said, "I want you to meet my kid one day." And I was like, well, damn. He was going to have a kid, super excited for my buddy. And I was potentially going to turn such a joyous time for him and his family into sadness and mourning and confusion if I went through with my original plan. So I was like, well, shit. Okay, plan B. I will just make it to the day that little P is born, and then I will sort of reconvene in this plan. Because then I figured I would sort of morally be off the hook a little bit, which sounds, again, like I'm a really awful person. But that literally was what I thought. That was my thought process. So after that shift, I knew that there was a first responder only help number in my area. I called it. I figured that I could get some help in at least surviving the next several months, not only for my sake, but that of my son. Was put into contact with a culturally competent psychologist. And this is all during COVID, so our visits are all virtual, all over Zoom. And so I saw her for several times. I was actually told that in addition to some PTS and depression, work-related stuff, that I also likely had undiagnosed postpartum depression that were exacerbating my stressors. And apparently, 5% of women can actually have PPD up to 3 years after giving birth. And so I was within that time frame. But lots of work-related contributing factors to my suicidal ideations, which was ironic because after Ricky's whole ordeal, these were things that I studied and researched for others, and now I'm using that information for my own life. So I began taking antidepressants reluctantly because I was so worried about people finding out that I'm anything but perfect mentally. But within about a week, I felt an obvious shift in my mood. And then within the first month, I felt more like myself. Happy, optimistic, just go-getter, full of aspirations. But again, I was so worried about people finding out that I was struggling or had been struggling that I kept this all internally, which is very unfortunate and something that I, to this day, regret, because in that time frame, I had two friends die by suicide, and it's hard for me not to think, had I been open and honest, maybe that would have changed the end result for them. But again, I'm so worried about unfit for duty, right? If I'm declared unfit for duty, then I'm going to lose my job, my livelihood. And so lots of negativity bias that had set in. My psychologist actually had me do this specific exercise. And so when I teach, I do this, especially if I have newer officers in the group. And what she had me do and what I have people in the group do is I say, okay, I'm going to count to 10. In the 10 seconds, I want you to look around as frantically as you can, count as many black objects as you can, as fast as you can in the room around us. Okay. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10. Okay, stop. Close your eyes. Without looking, how many blue objects are around you? And people are like, what the fuck? You said black, chick. And I'm like, I know. But the point here is we see what we focused on, right? We were so focused on looking for black, reaffirming what is black around the room, which for us in law enforcement represents all the bad things, which we do need to be on the lookout for, right? Like criminality, furtive movements. These are things that help to keep us safe. But if that is all that we focus on, that is all we're going to see. We forget that there are good things in the world, positive things. Because we're so focused on looking for the black, we forget that there's blue. And so for me, it was a really simple exercise that really worked, really helped to sort of shift my mindset a little bit, that I needed to keep searching for the blue. And ultimately, I saw a lot less black. And so I continued to work with my psychologist, was taking my medication for over a year. Nobody knew. My fears never came to fruition. But as I started to get stronger mentally, I also became stronger physically. Exercise became very therapeutic for me. And I was really determined to sort of focus on myself for once in my life. And it was during this time that I really understood the impacts that occupational stressors and traumas have on us in law enforcement, things like bad calls, bad TCs, the societal impact on policing. And then in addition to all that, the organizational stressors and traumas, right? Like all the things that I talked about, unsupportive bosses that will eat you alive, department gossip, all those things really add up. And so I decided to go back to school, but less looking at the general psychology of things and more on the organizational side of things. So I go through online for my master's. I double up on my classes. So I graduated in a little over a year. I was still on patrol, but now I'm married to a guy from my police academy, ironic. And I'm now pregnant with my second son. But because now I see the work-related aspect to a decline in so many people's mental health, so many of my partners, as well as my own, I wanted to focus on what's called IO psychology, which is industrial and organizational psychology. And then I realized internally one shift that I no longer wanted to serve my community, the citizens. Instead, I wanted to serve my partners, other first responders, especially those that are struggling. And so I realized that in order to do that most effectively, I would need to leave my cop job, which is really hard because, again, that identity piece, right? It's really, really, really hard, especially when you're a generational cop. And so ultimately, I sort of did a trust fall with my dreams. I left my cop job in 2022 and went headfirst into my PhD program. I mentioned that I study organizational and occupational stressors and traumas. And so with that, I've become a suicidology subject matter expert, not only from my own experiences, but educationally. And of particular interest, I learned that there were three things that needed to happen. There's a researcher named Thomas Joyner. And in order for someone to die by suicide, three things need to happen. One, they need to sense isolation, real or perceived. They need to have a sense of burdensomeness. And number three is what he calls acquired capability, which I'm very interested in, was and currently interested in that and how it relates to first responders. So I study this quite a bit. But acquired capability describes the life experiences that create a desensitization to death, to pain. And he uses the word acquired because it's not something that we're born with. It's something that is made through our experiences that we go through. And so the fear of death and the urge towards this self-preservation that we all innately have are powerful instincts that we would have to overcome in order to die by suicide. Ricky had to do it. My other partners had to do it. We have to overcome this really innate self-preservation tendency that we all have. And so this acquired capability theoretically decreases the fear of death and pain sensitivity, which is important for our first responders because every shift, every call we go on involves death and pain and people suffering. And so that in relation to occupational trauma, that concept and how it impacts our first responders is real. And so this was something that really validated so many of my personal feelings as well as thoughts on preventative and mitigation strategies. And so that all really inspired me to write my book, Workicide, like Todd showed there. I love that he has that. Thanks, Todd. So Workicide, it's not suicide, which is death by self. It's not homicide, which is death by other, but workicide, death by career, which can be either in a figurative or literal sense. And so I wanted to give someone perhaps that was in my shoes that I was in. If someone is currently feeling so dark and miserable and they don't have a way to reach out, I wanted to give them something, a resource, help, education, things that they could do. Ultimately, hope. I just wanted to give them hope. And so this book has gone on to surpass my wildest expectations. It's become an Amazon bestseller, a #1 new release. And I think that it's done so well in the few months that it's been out is because we all, especially first responders, we all understand this concept of workicide, of work-related decline in our mental health. We all get that, but there's not a lot out there that tells us what we should do about it. And so that's a lot about what this book is. And so prepping for this book, one of the things that I wanted to do is interview hundreds of people. Anybody that would talk to me, survivors of suicide, clinicians, family members, anyone that would talk to me about mental health struggles as it relates to first responders. And so a clinician said something to me that was quite insightful. And what he said was, expecting a first responder to go through their career without negative mental health impacts is like expecting someone to walk through water and not get wet. And I was like, yeah, that's true. But then it kind of pissed me off because then I was like, well, if this is such an expected thing, then why the hell was I not told about this? Why was I not trained about this in the academy, on FTO? You know, throughout my career, as I'm sure many here, we go through hundreds, if not thousands of hours of training, and not one of those hours did anybody talk to me about the mental health impact of this job. Not one. I was taught many times how to survive if someone's trying to kill me or killing others and then trying to kill me. But what if the person who's trying to kill me is me? Why was I never trained on this? And so that is why I talk, I teach, I speak on this quite a bit. First responder jobs, especially law enforcement, whether you're sworn, non-sworn, sick leave supervisor, doesn't matter. This job will change you. And so if what is predictable is preventable, then why don't we apply that logic to first responder mental health? Why don't we predict contributing factors to first responder suicides and therefore help prevent them from happening in the first place? And so nowadays I do just that. In addition to being the wife of a cop, my husband's still on the force, and I'm the mama of two little boys. I work on my Ph.D. stuff. I conduct a lot of research. I have a certified therapy dog, a big old golden retriever that goes with me. We do a lot of critical incident debriefs and department stuff. And I speak about the concept of workicide quite a bit on podcasts and conferences because I just really want to normalize all of this. I really want this to be the catalyst for change in our industry, in law enforcement. Because this is important not only to save the lives of individuals, which is absolutely important, but think about the impact of everything that we've talked about so far on families, on marriages, on kids. And I can confirm, being the daughter of two first responders, two cops, that job shit absolutely affects home life and those within the home. And so this information, this education, this industry change really is for a generational benefit for the individual and for their family. And so this is sort of my mission. I really feel like I was put on this earth to do just that. My faith in God has a lot to do with everything that has happened to me so far. And I couldn't have set this all up more perfectly if I even tried. But really everything that happened to me really was for a reason. And that ultimately is to have gone through the shoes that I went through to help others going through them now. And so to glorify God and really continue the mission that he has set for me, I intentionally study the darkest stuff, suicide, death, pain, suffering, with the hope that I can give out flashlights and help others find a way when they're in that darkness. So I really do think the power of my story helps me do just that. So thanks for listening. Appreciate it.
Thank you, Stephanie. That as the third generation of my family to have become a first responder, man, that really hit home. I grew up in that environment without any real overt pressure from my dad or my grandpa. You just grow up in that and you realize that, hey, this is what stewards do. And it set me up for some really horrible shit. Because again, it wasn't just that I identified as a firefighter, it was in my DNA. That was what I believed.
Yeah.
And when it all came crashing down in one incident, in one moment, that was all over. It wasn't that I was injured and my career ended. I failed my family legacy. That's how I took it. And
Mhm.
I was so absolutely lost. I wasn't a firefighter anymore. I wasn't a first responder any longer. And on top of all of the shit that I experienced and the sense of failure in all of those people I couldn't save, that led to a night spent sucking on the front end of a 45.
Mm.
Um, can you talk a little bit more about that identity, about becoming so tied in to what it is that you do that it becomes who you are?
Mhm. Yeah, I think so often we can and do over identify as our job. And so this over identification really brings dire consequences, especially in law enforcement, especially for those that are about to retire or have sort of an involuntary um, separation from their department, right? Because what we think our retirement might look like isn't. And maybe the phone calls get less and less, people reach out less and less, and that really affects us, especially when we over identify. And so for me, um, initially, my purpose, my fulfillment, my self worth was tied to my professional role. And so I talk about that in the book as it relates to something called superhero syndrome. We probably can all figure out what that means, right? And so, because of how much that impacts us as first responders, but especially in law enforcement, it really contributes us to neglecting other aspects of our lives. And so this over identification, superhero syndrome is something that I think we need to do a better job at initially when we first have law enforcement professionals come in, when we first have dispatchers come in, when we first have fire personnel come in. We need to educate them that our individual sense of self needs to not be so excessively tied to our occupation, right? We're more than just our job. We're a mother, father, brother, sister, pet parent, baseball fanatic, whatever. Like, we have to have a multifaceted identity, especially if we want to survive this career.
Absolutely. I like to tell young firefighters that what you do is not who you are. You do what you do because of who you are, but it isn't who you are. So let's open it up for questions. Patrick, you've got a smirk on your face.
I do. I'm like super weirded out by my creepy lighting and background. I figure I'm in a hotel room in Coeur d'Alene, and my
Hoping
first thought was
I'm hoping it's something nice like an Embassy Suites and not some dive.
it's the well, it's the resorts, but in the background, I realized that my camera had the bed and all these mirrors, and I'm thinking, what is housekeeping going to think when they see this camera pointed at the bed and the mirrors? Stephanie, I really appreciate your courage doing this, and the book is fantastic, and the way it's set up. I personally am buying more copies so that I can start using it for the people I encounter who are going through something like that. And it's on my must-read list. Um, it's it's tough to eviscerate yourself and expose yourself the way that you are, and it does get easier over time, but it's not. It's never easy. And so I appreciate your courage and your sharing of your story, and you're going to help a lot of people doing this. So I'm grateful to know you and thankful to hear this.
No, thank you, Pat. That means a lot. Thank you.
I'd just like to add to that you've given voice and meaning to emotions and experiences we've probably all had, but didn't know how to give it a voice, didn't know how to explain it. Your description of the three things that are necessary before suicide, wow, that's powerful, and it explains a lot to those of us that have been there. And I think I can identify with Chappie on the dark spaces. You know, when I first got knocked out of the game, you described the medicating with whether it be alcohol or affairs. I ended up having an affair and ruining a 21-year marriage.
Not
And
with me,
not
not with
not
me.
with her.
So just to be clear.
Yeah, and it wasn't a good relationship. It was just shit behavior, right? Trying to just cope with it all. And the long-term consequences of that have just still, 30 years later, my daughters are still very distant. And you're right, we don't teach enough to our personnel as they're coming into first responder industries, and that needs to change. In San Diego in 1978, PSA 183 went down, and we lost over 100 first responders after responding to that plane crash. And yet you fast forward to the Mira City bombing, when McVeigh took out the Mira building, but more importantly and more tragically, the daycare on the first floor. And we didn't lose a single first responder. And the reason is because of critical incident stress debriefing. And so all that suck it up buttercup crap that we had been fed from the previous generations changed during that period of time between those two incidents. And I remember the response of my fellow officers and first responders, paramedics, firefighters, when we would have a officer involved shooting. In 10 years, we had 11 shootings, and we would have these critical incident stress debriefs. And the first ones, nobody wanted to say a word, and that was okay, right? They didn't have to. It was the goal there was to get them in the room and get them thinking up here, not in the mammalian brain. But today, I hope, I pray it's better, and that they're getting exposed to self-care, so that we don't end up in that place where we've ticked off the 3 boxes before we take our own life. Thank you for your work. I'm looking forward to getting your book.
Thank you. And thank you for sharing that.
Thanks, Todd. Michelle?
Stephanie, I just want to say thank you also. I think your story is one of just courage and vulnerability and just relatability. I can appreciate you taking the time to pull in the aspects that a lot of times we don't consider play into the role of how did we get to this moment? During some of my darkest moments, I was a single mom. So I appreciate you bringing in that aspect, because that's just another thing that people don't realize. Hey, this is contributing. Our home life contributes, what we experience with our other coworkers, our leadership contributes. So much of it. It's not just a one thing did it. It's a whole domino effect. So I appreciate you taking the time and the vulnerability to share that, because that helps those of us who have been there to realize, wow, okay, it's not just me. And having spent the first half of my career as a dispatcher in Southern California, I know about all the post training. So I appreciate what you're doing to try to bring that in. There was no critical incident stress debrief for the first half of my career. The second half was spent in Nevada, and there was the debriefs there by that point. However, dispatchers weren't allowed to go into the officer ones because they didn't want to scar us. So luckily, our lovely firefighters actually invited us into debriefs. So once I finally experienced a real debrief, it made a big difference in how I processed some of those tough calls. So I just want to say thank you, and I truly appreciate your authenticity, because that's what's going to make a difference with all the rest of first responders.
Thank you. I appreciate that.
Thanks, Michelle. Jim?
You talked about the involuntary separation issue, and I totally get that. I spent 40 years working in the fire service, and so and separated, not necessarily in the way I had it figured out. And that's my point is, we have those involuntary separations that occur because you get fired, you get injured, whatever. But we also have the sort of normal separations, the kind of like you're planning to retire, but maybe it's just not going exactly the way you thought it was going to go, right? So, or you be like me and, make a decision at a moment where you just like, yeah, I just got to go, right? And so with that, I've seen people, as I always say, get weird, at the end, where they're going to fix everything that's wrong with the organization before they leave, because they're leaving shortly, those types of things. And so I think that's one of those red flag kind of things for people to pay attention to when you have that person that's, they're not being fired, they're not going out on a disability, but they're departing the organization for retirement purposes, but it's just not exactly how they sort of had it figured out when they opened up that retirement book on the first day and said, I'm going to retire when I'm 54 years old. I'm going to get 88% of my salary. And I'm going to live life happily ever after. Right. And it just doesn't happen that way. And so I say that as like, that's just one of those things that is out there. That's kind of a thing. And then you brought up the line of duty death versus suicide thing. And that's a struggle for me. I take exception to the issue when I hear it stated that we have more people dying in the line of dying due to suicide versus the line of duty. And the reason I take exception to that is, again, because of the decades I was involved in the fire service, we spent a tremendous amount of time and energy and money on fixing line of duty death. We improved equipment, we improved training, we improved policies, we improved, whatever, right? We committed the resources to that. Unfortunately, we haven't taken the same approach to behavioral wellness, suicide prevention, etc. And so it's kind of an apples and oranges thing, right? And so I encourage people to say, what we need to do is identify the fact that we committed all this resource to reducing line of duty death. It's time for us to commit those resources to these other issues and have an impact in the same way. So that's my comments.
Yeah, could not agree more. Absolutely.
Yeah, Jim, before I get to Rita, I want to, I've always been an advocate for referring to what we deal with as post-traumatic stress injury. And I've actually advocated with the DSM to make that change because it's a duty related injury, but nobody gets a Purple Heart. Nobody gets a Valor Award for it. And I honestly think when it leads to a first responder taking their own life, isn't it really line of duty? I mean, when we roll on a house fire or a structure, it's kind of a failure of fire prevention.
Right.
And we have this ongoing conflagration of first responder suicide. Well, that is a failure of preventive measures.
Yeah. I will say that in one of the organizations I work with, we recently treated a suicide as basically a line of duty death. As far as the follow-up, right? I have no idea what will work out in the financial side, but at least in the honor side, right? We dealt with it in that way. And I know that there's recently an Alameda City guy that it's very well documented. It was related to his post-traumatic stress and, all that kind of stuff. And they treated it the same way. Who knows what will happen on the financial side, but at least the acknowledgement that they acknowledge that this was an outcome of the post-traumatic stress.
Yep. Rita?
So Stephanie, I wanted to thank you it's just such a tough subject. I mean, and even for us women who go into a male dominated job, you know, like when I joined the military in 1981, you know, being a firefighter and stuff, everybody thought I was gay, or, you know, I just wanted to be in the military, and, you know, it was tough. But you become that superhuman being to prove that you can do the job. You know, it's like I had gotten so many different qualifications just to show that I was worth something sometimes, when in fact it was like I gave up a lot of family time to do those courses and classes and gain those pieces of paper that say, hey, look, I can do this, or I did this, or I'm special at that. And what does it get you in the end? But lost time with family, and, you know, a sense of, yeah, I've got all these pieces of paper, but who am I really? You know, I'm going to a women's symposium tomorrow night for vets, for women vets. And I'm going to ask some questions that you brought up tonight that I think are important. The military doesn't have that type of program. And I think that's really sad, because you get 20 years of, you know, stop complaining and do your job, or there are going to be repercussions. And the military doesn't have critical incident stress debriefing. And I think that's really sad. And it's something I'll bring up tomorrow night and say, what are we doing for our vets now? Or what are we doing for our active duty members now? You know, we were always so far behind in technology, believe it or not, in, you know, in certain things. Some of the firefighting gear we were using up until I retired was so antiquated. It was just ridiculous. We didn't, you know, when I retired in 2001, a lot of ships still didn't have SCBAs. We were still using these old, antiquated, huge oxygen breathing apparatus, you know, and it's just, so I know that they're still probably not dealing with the mental aspect of being gone from your family for 2, 3, 4, 5, 6 months, a year, whatever, you know. And it's hard on military families, on married couples, because you get into that routine when you're gone, where you don't have those responsibilities, that you have kids and all the other stuff. But when you get home, you've got to try to fit back into that life where the wife or the husband has, you know, gotten the kids in their routine and all of that. You know, they do things a certain way, and then you kind of come back after so much time, and it's just, it's really tough fitting back into that. And I don't think they offer enough mental health for the military when it comes to those things. So you gave me some ideas of some questions that I'm going to ask tomorrow night. So thank you for that.
Absolutely. You go. Absolutely.
And Rita, one of the toughest firefighters I ever knew, her name was Pam Foxworthy. I joined the department in 1981, and she got laughed at until she kicked the shit out of 3/4 of our cohort in the physical agility test. And I finally got to meet her as we were both around the side of the fire station, puking our guts up in the bushes after the physical agility test. But she kicked the crap out of a lot of the guys.
Yeah. Yep. I totally get it. You know, and there were some girls that shouldn't have been in the fire service, and I totally get that too. But don't group us all as one, because there are some of us that really belong there. You
Amen.
know?
All right. Anybody else have any questions?
Well, I just thought I'd come say hi. Hi, Stephanie.
Hi, Chris.
Good to
Good to
see
see you
you.
on.
What's up, bro?
Not much. How's it going, guys?
Doing all right. Glad to
Good,
see
that's
you.
good. Yeah. I saw Stephanie was on here. I was sitting there literally, and I looked on LinkedIn, and I was like, oh, Stephanie's there. I better jump on for the last 10 minutes.
Hmm.
All right. Well, we can go ahead and end the recording.